way to start. Testing? Oh. Wonderful. All right, hello everyone. Thank you and for being here. Welcome to everything you're doing wrong when making sheet music and how to fix it. I'm excited to see people here for this presentation. Dedicated just to notating sheet music, so not arranging or writing or orchestrating or being successful or anything like that. Just sheet music. And a lot of people, surprisingly, can have some pretty strong opinions about this subject. So I think first I will tell you who I am. My name's Thomas Kresge. I'm a professional orchestrator and copyist for films and games and theater and pinball tables, apparently. So, and amongst the crowd here, some people might also know me as the lead producer and arranger for the Game Brass, who performed on the main stage at MAGFest last year. So as a copyist, it's my job to make sure that the sheet music that goes in front of musicians at, say, a recording session is perfect. We want it as clear and consistent as possible to not waste any time or money and have a just successful read-through of things. Generally, the musicians I'm working with are sight-reading stuff, so that's a really important priority, is that it's just pretty clear right from the get-go. And so I wanted to have this panel to share some of the knowledge I've learned working in the industry, and this is stuff that I've learned from other people who have far more experience than me testing this on the stand with musicians over the years. So we're gonna kind of go over some common mistakes I've seen in a lot of writing and some best practices to help improve your writing for musicians. But before we even get into that, I do want to talk about why I think this even matters at all, since even I can admit that the sheet music is maybe not the most important element. You know, just writing stuff well and playing it well is great. But in the end, this helps. This helps with your musicians realize what you're trying to do in the end. It makes your intent more clear as a composer or arranger. It's gonna save you time in rehearsals, as people won't be asking questions. It provides a lot more confidence for your players. If you are a musician who plays music and you get something that's notated poorly in front of you, you're immediately a little bit on edge, and maybe you don't even trust the writer very much anymore, and you're going to question their intelligence, and we don't want that. So the clearer this is and the better it is from the start, the better your music will be down the road. It's a matter of fixing problems before they even become a problem. So anyway, with that out of the way, let's jump into some things. I'm just going to go over a bunch of different practices, stuff I've seen, stuff you can immediately apply, no matter what your notation software is. And the first thing I want to talk about is the biggest problem I see overall, beaming, which is how we're connecting notes together on the page. So we have this concept in engraving called the invisible bar line, which means that we want to pretend that there's a extra bar line between beats 2 and 3 in our music and use ties and such accordingly. So there's several examples here. The top line, there's always the incorrect version. The bottom line, the correct one. And I also want to note that I will have these slides available afterwards. If you go to my website's kresgemusic.com/magfest, they're there. This panel is being recorded. And if you ever have questions in the middle, feel free to just ask, but we'll also have questions at the end. So all this, you don't have to memorize it on the spot, don't worry. So anyway, beaming. The idea is we want to see where beats are. When you're looking at a piece of music, the point of beams is to see the meter, to understand the time signature, and that helps keep people together and sight read what's going on. With the idea here being that especially beats 1 and 3 are visible, though it's nice to see 2 and 4 depending on the complexity of your rhythm. So all of these are examples of something crossing over this so-called invisible bar line and obscuring that beat. So the rhythm looks a little bit weird, or it looks like the time signature is something different than it might be. There are exceptions to this rule, though, which we see down here. Really common rhythms like half notes and dotted half notes that start on a beat. Those can cross that bar line just fine. They're simple enough where we don't need to clutter things up with extra ties. Just note that if it's not on the beat, use ties. It's about consistency and clarity. Because, again, the purpose of beams in music these days is to show meter, not phrasing of the music. We don't use it to show phrasing. In fact, I have an example at the bottom right here where they're beamed to show phrasing, a common mistake I've seen. We don't want that. Break them up. Everybody will read stuff happier. But this concept is actually most important in rhythms like this. Video game music is awash with these kinds of complex syncopated rhythms. Bonus points if you know any of the tunes up on the screen right now. So these 16th patterns, in every case you can find where beat 1 is, where beat 2 is, where 3 and 4 is, and everybody will be a little bit more together, even with more complex patterns like this. But there's a lot more to beaming. I was afraid that this panel was almost going to be 60 minutes of that, so we'll try not to spend the whole time on this. But some other points I want to make. So again, my philosophy in writing music is that the point is for it to be clear and consistent and not be confused with other stuff. So this first thing is something that actually some people disagree with me on, but they're wrong, which is beaming eighth notes in groups of threes. To me, it looks like a triplet, and there's no reason to do that when there's a clearer option. So split them up so we can see the beats. Generally, don't beam over rests. It, again, obscures beats more. It looks more cluttered, though the exception being if everything is within a beat, go ahead and do it. Because, again, we're trying to just see those beats. The point of beaming is to read the meter clearly, especially if things get more complicated. We have a lot of examples you can just see here of where we do or do not maybe want to do that, beaming over rests. One example in 12/8, fun times. Moving on. So what about other time signatures? So I said 4/4, there's an invisible bar line between 2 and 3. How do we apply this elsewhere? We just kind of adapt the rule to make sense with that meter. With 3/4 time, the point is don't make it look like 6/8. Same number of eighth notes, but we need to make sure our beats are 1, 2, 3, and not 1 and a 2 and a, or whatever, however you count 6/8 in your life. So there's like 2 valid examples in this sample here. Personally, I prefer the one in the middle because you see all the beats more clearly, but again, certain common rhythms, it's fine to cross. If there's no 16th notes involved, you usually don't have as big of a problem. But again, this is the most common thing I see in arrangements I've looked at of other people, is just beaming being all over the place, and it creates just an extra challenge to read through when you're already worried about notes and sight reading and all that in the first place. As an example of 6/8, I wanted to show this at the bottom. This entire line, the top line is beamed in a way where it looks more like 3/4 rather than 6/8. So the musician's going to have a weird time feeling where's 1, where's 2. How do we get this feel? And the biggest one I actually want to point out is at the bottom here. Sometimes people like to just have 3/4 notes in the middle of their phrase, which I guess it makes sense. It's not too weird, but I like consistency. Here we're splitting. I love being able to see beat too, our downbeats. And so do your musicians. Even if they don't know they like that, they do. Big thing about engraving and getting good at it is knowing what other people don't even know they prefer to see. And I could go on and on with other time signatures. So 5/4 is in almost all examples of 5/4 music, it's a grouping of 3 beats plus 2 beats. So beam it like that, as if you've got a 3/4 bar and then a 2/4 bar, rather than beaming it like it's something else, like 6/8 and then 2/4, or just 4 plus 1. There is sometimes where that happens. I'm just noting it's not very common. So think about where you're feeling those bigger beats. How does your music divide up, and write it in a way that demonstrates that meter? Sometimes there are multiple valid options. In this case, I do see people who will beam 6 together. I don't think it's terribly bad. I think it's a little harder to read than having it broken up, but I'll accept some room for disagreement there. Or 7/8. This is another example where we have pretty often seeing a specific way it's presented as 3 eighth notes plus 2 plus 2. Sorry, I got that backwards. 2 plus 2 plus 3 is how most 7/8 music tends to be felt. Not all, but most. And again, we're just beaming to make that clear. This example at the bottom is just fully written out in a way that would be that I would deem correct for such a phrase. one of a small handful of video game pieces in 7/8. It was on the page, yes, at the top. The one at the bottom is from Sonic Adventure 2. It's a Mad Space. A good example because it's a very complicated piece in 7/8. And just a whole mess of other miscellaneous rules when it comes to beaming that I just felt compelled to talk about, which actually not beams, but res, the related topic. Same beat visibility rules. We want to see the beats. Beaming is for meter, not for phrasing, and this is a line of several examples of res done one way and then done in a preferred way. One kind of quirk, this is more just convention than there being a great reason for it. We don't want to use dotted res in common times like 4/4, 3/4. They're just reserved for compound meters, 6/8, stuff like that. Break them up when you see that. The couple exceptions there being that if you're dotted rests that are smaller than a quarter note because they are within one beat. Again, we're able to see that beat, break it up, or sorry, it can be consolidated. And if you have like a fermata situation here, it's good that every musician is seeing a similar type of rhythm for their hold. Then we might use a dotted rest. Otherwise, break them up in common time and reserve them for compound meters like this. Last thing I just wanted to mention is if you've looked at old music before, there used to be a convention in vocal music of splitting up beams for every single lyric or syllable. This is antiquated. We don't do this anymore. It looks ugly. So just beam vocal music the way you would any instrumental piece, because beams are for meter, not phrasing. Next topic, accidentals. I got a lot less to say about this because people tend to not mess this up as much. But the general idea is you kind of have to learn a little music theory and understand what accidentals make sense for the music, that you're not having weird enharmonics. This is especially important because the way we read music is not really reading individual notes, but reading shapes we see on the page. And so if I'm a piano player and I see just 3 notes nicely stacked like that, I immediately assume it's a certain kind of thing I'm trying to play. And if it's a different shape, I assume it's a different pattern. And if there's some incongruity there, then I'm doing a double take and having to read more of the music than is necessary, and now I'm a measure behind. So that's where our importance in these accidentals comes in, is just making sure the shapes of music on the page look correct to us, to our eyes. Most notation software just does this automatically these days, but courtesy accidentals are not technically required, but are nice to have all the time. Just don't put them in a parenthesis because it's busy and messy. Where there's always a balance we're trying to get in writing music between that clarity and consistency, but it not being an overload of information or too messy. And if you're unfortunate enough to have a double accidental show up in your music, and if you don't know what that is, that's good. Just keep it that way. But generally, I would say remove it. This is a case where the theoretical purpose of it is less important than just the sight readability of it, with the exceptions being if there is a very obvious shape, keep it in there. That's really the only reason to maintain a double accidental. And sometimes you can even just use something that's enharmonically incorrect, because it's more commonly seen. Like we see at the bottom here, an E flat 7 chord to somebody who's used to reading chords is way more recognizable than D sharp 7. And sometimes it's fine to just break the enharmonic rules for the sake of easy reading. Now that was the most fun stuff, is beaming and accidentals. Now the academic stuff, which is formatting the score. But this is something where I'm gonna give a bunch of like pedantic details, but this is the thing. If you look at 2 pieces of music, and one like looks okay, but you can tell it's not, like, it doesn't look super professional. This is sort of the details that suddenly make something look really well notated or engraved, or these like formatting details that are hard to pick out if you're not familiar with them. So first bit of advice I want to tell to people is to put measure numbers on every single measure. So nobody ever has to ask about or nobody has to count bars ever again. And the next question I usually get, though, is how do I do that without it becoming a huge mess? Because that is a lot of extra ink on the page. So here's your example. Like, this is a score. where the numbers are beneath every single bar, centered, bold, far enough away to not get in the way of something else, and not italic because that tends to look a little messier. You can circle them if you want. Some people do. Your choice. I don't circle them personally. In parts, we make them very small. So this is something we want as reference, but it doesn't really need to be read in real time. So I think in my parts, the numbers are like a size 0.3 font or something. They're really tiny, but they're there when you need them, and they're very out of the way. At the start of every measure, centered with the bar line, not bold, not italic, just nice and ready. Though sometimes it can get cluttered with lower music or stuff that has like a bunch of extra information underneath, like accident or dynamics and ties and stuff. This is a tuba part, and in this case, we just grab all of them and pull them down. Easy enough. But put bar numbers on every measure. I said beaming was maybe one of the most important things you can try to get right. This is probably the other most important thing. Is just put bar numbers everywhere. It makes life easier for everybody. The only time I don't is in lead sheets, maybe solo music, like a piano solo piece, because they don't necessarily need that. Choral music, maybe, if it's starting to get in the way of the lyrics, but generally that's not an issue. Try to keep them if you can there. They can go above or below the staff, somewhere at the beginning of the system. If you haven't heard the word system, by the way, that's like our technical term in music for a line of music, including all of the staffs on that line, rather than just calling it a staff. But there's more ways. Big hot tip here is use double bar line. So when I say double bar line, I'm talking about this guy here with two normal bar lines next to each other. Use those all throughout your music to stay organized. Like, I expect to see one every 2 to 8 measures in a piece of music usually, maybe up to 32 measures, something like that. But the point is you have a new section, a new phrase, there's a double bar line there. And if you look at this part, your eyes can probably immediately jump to where a new phrase is going to start just by having that double bar line, which is really subtle and out of the way, but very convenient, especially if somebody's got a lot of rest or gets slightly lost, they're going to hear that start and suddenly be back on. And it's a way better way of organizing music than using rehearsal marks all over the place, which you can still use, but keep them infrequent. Personally, I don't use them hardly at all, but they can be nice in longer music. I just recommend using letters instead of numbers so that you don't have bar numbers and rehearsal numbers confusing people. You could stop here and walk away just beaming your music right, using bar numbers, and using double bar lines, and I would be a lot happier as a human. But there's still more we could go through, of course. So making your score look nice. So again, this is the details where I'm like, you look at this score and hopefully think, yes, that looks like somebody who knows what they're doing made it, versus this person just opened up the finale for the first time and didn't change any settings. Let's look at some of the details we see here. We see these giant time signatures. If you don't know how to do that, just Google it. It's really a highly answered question for notation software, getting those large time signatures. We have big tempo text. Think about what the conductor wants to actually see on the score. They care about the time, they care about the tempo, they don't really care about the individual notes. So the stuff that's important to them is much larger in this case. One little thing we like to do now that I think makes the scores look super clean is hiding bar rests. So all these empty measures just have nothing in them. They don't have a whole rest or anything. They're just empty. Reduces clutter, reduces ink, leaves room for the conductor to write notes. Very nice way to just make the score look cleaner, though I also need to note to still keep them in the parts. We only hide them in the score. One of the biggest things that actually jumps out to me when I look at some scores, like a big rookie mistake, is having like 47 measures on a page. And this is, I think, a big thing because of the way notation software defaults to. They try to fit a lot on there, which is like everything's still legible, but it starts to look really busy. And again, if a conductor is looking at the music and they look up for a second and then they look back down and there's too many measures, they're going to get lost as well. And so reduce the number of bars you have per page to 4 to 8 is a good sweet spot. You might have a couple more sometimes, just so things are a little more spread out and legible. Other little tips I like that I don't like, other tips I like to share. I don't like to hide any empty measures. So in other words, on this second page, some of the guys are just resting the whole page, and I've seen folks who will just hide those stabs altogether. Kind of makes the score a little harder to read when each page is a little different than the last. So generally we like to keep them consistent. And now here's some details if you want to memorize one day or look this up afterwards on how to actually make your page look good. Staff size is the distance from the top line of a staff to the bottom. So like 4 millimeter staff size means that it's literally 4 millimeters. The number is only important so you know what to set and then save. The great thing about this stuff is that you can save it as like a house style or library in your software and then never have to think about it again because you just copy that template each time. So get it right once and it will be right forever. Our scores are always formatted portrait. Landscape tends to just not look as good. It's harder to print. It doesn't fit with all your other music. The page turns are more awkward. So just always use portrait, landscape, and multiple systems if if there's only a few staves to deal with. One question you might ask too is to transpose the score or not. Honestly, this just depends on the setting and your conductor. When we do recording sessions, they're always in concert, but it seems in like live music with orchestras, it's usually transposed. So if you're in doubt, just ask somebody whose opinion matters there, the conductor, and go with either one. I tend to prefer concert scores just for quick reading, but it's kind of up in the air. Depends on the context. But more people look at the part than they look at the score. So getting this right is really helpful as well. Again, a big thing to maybe take home is to not put too much on the page. I usually see people trying to really crunch things pretty hard onto one page, and then it's just it's frustrating to read as it's easy to get lost and find your place throughout. So good rules of thumb here is that our staff size is about 7 millimeters, maybe bigger if people are sharing a part because it might be further away, maybe smaller because there might be page turns we have to think about in a piano part or something. You're balancing that legibility with turning pages, honestly, in the end. In our parts, we're averaging about 8 to 10 systems, so that's each of those lines. That means if you have a piano part, a system is both staffs together, and about 4 to 8 bars per system. So another tip here is like look at the lines and think about try to make them actually not uniform, like not 4 bars on every staff for the sake of reading. If I'm reading, it's really easy to miss a line or repeat if everything looks similar. So 4 or 5, just so that those, if you look vertically, the bar lines don't exactly line up. On the flip side, if you're doing a part that's mostly like improv and just has chord changes, then actually that uniformity is nice because it shows you the form of the piece, the phrasing to the musician. Since they're not actually looking at every note, they just kind of need to know when they feel this beat, what am I supposed to be playing? Speaking of improv though, so let's talk about what I'm going to call roadmap notation. This is notation for semi-improvised parts or rhythm section parts, stuff where somebody is going to play mostly a groove throughout. So we've got a lot of like these rock orchestra kind of arrangements, and the key thing in these parts is you don't need to write every single note. In fact, you hardly need to write any notes at all for the most part. We care about seeing a groove and just knowing what to do, and then just having the minimum information you need to follow the rest of the band. So what that looks like here is, in this case, we have a measure that's a groove written out that the drummer may or may not follow exactly, and then just a bunch of slashes for who knows how many measures to follow. Meanwhile, if I want them to make a hit with the band, there'd be something like this just written above it. Or if I want them to actually kind of stop time and do specific hits, then you'd see this kind of slash notation. So giving them a roadmap to the music of what's going on is what we call it, but not trying to tell them exactly what to play. Unless you are very particular and you really want a specific thing, then write that. But generally, you don't need that much information, especially if it's just like do a basic rock groove for 64 measures. It's pretty much all you need to write. We have these nice consolidating bars where it means to repeat the last 4 measures, or you can do it with 2. These are great for these types of parts to just show them repeat the last 4 measures with that same groove, so they don't have to think too hard about it. I want to note, don't ever use these though in normal instrumental parts, because again, think about where somebody's eyes are going. If you're playing oboe and you have notes you need to think about, you're going to see the repeat and then have to look back a measure and then have to skip ahead a measure. A drummer's going to see the repeat and just count for 4 measures, right? So here's an example of it actually happening in a piece of music. Quick note about this key at the top. There's more than one way to notate drum set. Different drummers will give you their own opinion. So what I have here is just one example, and you don't need to label the things they're playing. They'll figure it out. If you have a different thing you like more, then go ahead and do that. But the only thing that's really universal in drum set notation is probably the snare drum being on the third space and the kick drum being somewhere on the bottom space or line. Everything else is a little bit flexible. Anyway, this is a part a drummer got. They did have a mock-up to listen to, so they had a little bit of idea what to play, but it's pretty basic, just there to have something. So this is pretty much all the drummer was given, and still able to figure out a lot of what was going on. So what you're going to hear actually starts at measure 3, by the way, but you can kind of see what they were able to figure out just by having this kind of notation. Hopefully this actually plays. This part here, there's a specific written out pattern I wanted them to play, which we have for several measures, before I want them to just switch to a standard swing time feel. And that's all you have to tell them, and a good player will know what to do. And otherwise follow rests or specific rhythmic hits as I want, based on maybe the rest of the music is good. What to pay attention to here is how they'll make these extra hits that are written above the staff with the band, starting at this moment. So that's that, and my way of advertising my upcoming big band album. But less is more in these. In fact, here's another more extreme example of how we don't need very much. This is 128 measures of slashes. In fact, I should have had more of those repeat slashes here to make this even more legible and probably save a page. Where all I should have done was written rock at the start. I didn't write anything, so that's a mistake. But then they just know what to do and know when there's some rhythmic hits. The most notable addition here in this part is that I did outline the form and said, here's the verse, here's a chorus. The implication being the drummer will see that and hopefully do something a little bit different when. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Oh, God. I love when I mess something up. Where did it go? Bear with me, everybody. I don't know what I touched. It's a good way to make yourself look like a professional. Thank you. Okay. Well, let's just start the whole panel over. Dun, dun, dun. Quick review.
Is this on the test?
Yes, this will be. There is a test at the end, so I hope you were taking notes. But the answer key's online, so it's open book. Okay, here we were. Yeah, so they hardly need any information to know what to do. And in fact, less is more, because sometimes these instruments or the players are just going to be more used to doing their own thing. So he knows what to do for 120 measures, just being told to play a rock groove, and maybe hearing what everybody else is doing. You can use like text instructions like we have here to tell them what to do. Otherwise, again, you can keep it rather simple. Unless you really have some crazy specific idea on what you will need them to do. In a related world, guitar and bass, I should have also said piano parts. All these other parts where people play chords. It's something similar. Just give them a chord symbol. Maybe you can just tell them the specific type of groove you're expecting, a swing time or a rock groove or whatever, and some slashes. And that's all they need to get by. If you want them to play something specific, you write that in, and don't give them chords, or else they'll play chords and ignore what you wrote. Though sometimes you could, like over in these measures over here, I could have written a chord symbol underneath that, and then maybe said ad lib underneath, and that would tell the player, do something that looks like this. It doesn't need to be these exact notes, but do something like this. In this case, I would say that the guitarist, the famous guitarist, took more liberties than I told him to, but that's fine. What's the part you do? You guys get the picture. I'm sorry. When I rehearsed at home, there was 2 screens in front of me, not one way off there. Okay. So, bonus round. All the hot tips I have and stuff not to do, or that I would recommend avoiding when you're writing stuff down. So first point is I notice people like to use octave lines sometimes when they see a bunch of ledger lines. Octave lines are specifically for keyboard instruments, piano, the harp, maybe some mallets. Like a flute player is used to reading 37 ledger lines, and so if you give them an octave line, their fingerings are actually different in that octave, so it messes them up a bit. So exclusively for keyboard parts. There's like some exceptions if you have like a violinist playing super high, but if they're doing that, then you probably already hopefully know what you're giving them. A bit about pedal markings. I think they're kind of unnecessary. Piano players know how to use the pedal and don't need to be told. So I would say keep them out, but if you are going to use them, try to use the right ones. The second example where it's a little less cluttered. I would just do this last line though. If you write something like this, I guarantee any piano player is going to pedal that and know what to do. It's sort of like telling someone what fingering to use on their instrument. I don't think it's usually necessary unless you're doing something idiosyncratic. There's a whole bunch of redundant instructions I'll sometimes see. Writing the same thing twice when one symbol alone would be fine. A lot of this is like little details that maybe don't make a huge difference, but I do think that the less distraction the musician has, especially if they're sight reading, the better. So we're trying to reduce too much extra clutter, too much extra stuff to read for cleaner music overall. Like you don't usually need to tell somebody to choke a cymbal if they just have something like this. That's really the only option they have. You can't play a pizzicato note any shorter than it already is, except on like bass. So you don't need staccato notes. So no need to say something twice when one marking gets the job done. This is a little bit, there might be some controversy about this. I know people might disagree with me, but I don't think you even need to mark divises in most music. People will see 2 notes and they'll know to split up, because most instruments can't play 2 notes, and string players don't actually like playing 2 notes if they don't have to, especially if a non-string player told them to. So they will almost always just divide naturally if you put that in. And it reduces all the information to have to put in divisi unison all over the place. If you do know what you're doing and give them what's called a double stop, you can notate it one way or the other. Again, not both, either using a bracket like this or writing non-divisi. Idea is a lot of stuff musicians will do naturally. Learning what they do without instruction is kind of good in understanding what is worth writing or what doesn't need to be written. More information, dynamics. Make them aligned. Dynamics should be on the same row and the same plane. I know Sibelius does it automatically. Finale has a plugin to do it for you if you didn't know that exists. If you have questions afterwards about notation software, I know how to use Sibelius very well, and I've used Finale professionally, but not as versed. If MuseScore is your only option, that's great. I know you can accomplish scores that look professional in MuseScore because I've seen them. I can't really speak for Dorico because I've barely touched it. But there's that if you ever have any questions about stuff like that on how to actually achieve this. Anyway, back to dynamics. Keeping them in a row so they're all aligned. Making sure you reintroduce them later. Think about, again, from the perspective of a musician. This is easy to forget if you're not looking at the actual part, so it's just kind of keeping this in mind as you're notating stuff through the score to avoid questions. A reminder, if you ever write choir music, vocal music, dynamics always go above the staff, even if there's no lyrics in the piece, and they're just like singing ahs, still put them up there. Slurs are slurs. They're for legatos. In some older music or modern music, I guess, they're used as a phrase marking over a long period of music, and that's kind of useless in my opinion. Just use them as legatos in smaller bits, or as bowings if you know what you're doing with string players. And the last thing I love to introduce is the cool way to write trills these days, where you tell somebody the actual step, a half step or a whole step for a trill. And you have the trill line just with that little indication. We do this in a lot of like recording sessions because we don't use key signatures, so it's less clear what they should do diatonically. Again, if you don't know how to make this line in your notation software, it's not very hard. You Google it, and there's people who have actually already made templates you can just import in, and then you have it for life. And last thing I want to throw out there, if you're writing a percussion part, generally speaking, you want to notate this by instrument. Think about, or not instrument, by player. Think about how many players you're going to have and how they're going to have to choreograph themselves across their section to play everything. And otherwise, it's preferred to keep it on one line like this, one staff, rather than break it up into several staves, which tends to be more annoying to read and just take up more space. Okay. And there you have the list of tips. Now there's actually I'm going to go through a score in a bit, but some other resources, places where I've learned all this and where you can, if you're weird enough to keep caring about notation, always feel free to reach out to me. My information is up there. If you scan that QR code, it'll actually take you to the Game Brass Discord, where I'm pretty easy to reach. But some other highly recommended places. So Tim Davies is probably the most prolific orchestrator on the planet. If you've watched a movie before or played a video game, you've probably heard music he's worked on. He's got a blog, and a lot of the information I've talked about here is actually is somewhat borrowed from there, though I learned it before that. But he's got a lot of information about notation, orchestration, stuff that from somebody who deals with new music almost every single day. Similar blogs to learn this stuff is Of Note by the late Robert Puff, who was a copyist based out of Seattle. Similar things, but there's a lot more info on that place about how to use your notation software to accomplish some of this stuff. Same thing with Scoring Notes, a lot of tips about using the software to take control of your music. Notation Central is just a website with a lot of extra resources, both paid and free, for mostly notation software. There's fonts and stuff there too that are good for different styles of music. And then some books. Behind Bars is a really textbook size tome, but is like the most comprehensive guide on notating sheet music. It goes into such details as like how much inches are supposed to be between every line on a staff that you don't really need to think about, but it's a very good resource for if you think of how do I do this, it has a decent answer. Much less comprehensive, but maybe easier to get through is this Alfred's Dictionary of Music Notation. And then there's a book called Harp Scoring. You can actually find it, I think, online for free as a PDF. And then How to Write for Percussion. Two instruments, harp and percussion, that people tend to falter with quite often. So good to have like independent resources on that. Again, the slides are available at my website if you ever feel the need to review any of this. So before we jump into a score to do some fixing and editing and see how all this comes together for real, are there any questions, disagreements? Yeah.
Before, when you were talking about writing out the score not in a uniform way, but in the phrasing and such, so that you don't miss repeat the rest of the stuff. Can you do that for every single instrument, so that every single part, because they're not all going to be uniform?
Yeah, so beaming, if you're talking about beaming or phrase markings, like slurs.
It was more of the scoring aspect, because you were saying don't keep just 4 to 8 measures per system if it makes more sense to do that.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, in the parts, it's just going to depend part to part. They're not all going to be exactly the same.
So you do go through every single part. It's like, all right,
Yeah.
have like
Yeah.
this and violins got that.
Yeah, through each one by one. I mean, it's. I mean, you get good at it if you do it a lot, but it's also you set. One of the biggest tips I can say about using notation software is learn how to change its default behavior. Because I find a lot of people will like look at something and they'll click and drag it into place, and they'll be like, great, it's done. And then the next score, they have to do the same thing. So learn how to tell it, I want it this way every way, and then you don't have to do it ever again. So learn how to set that default behavior, because then it's much faster to go through everything, and you can get it to largely get you 95% of the way there at that point, rather than doing the click and drag treatment. Yes?
I kind of have two questions. The first is, and I had it in my head and I blanked on the term, but do you have any thoughts on like the page at the beginning of the score that has like notes and like, I can't think of the word. You know what I'm talking
Like
about?
program notes
Not program
or a title
notes.
page?
Like where you might, like if you might clarify how you're notating your percussion or like
Like a key, I guess?
I guess so, yeah. I can't think of the name for it. But do you have any thoughts on like using a page like that for anything that's unclear?
I mean, if you would need to. I think ideally, I can't, I'll say this, I've never had to do that, except I think in like one choral piece, because they wanted the singers to like pat their head or something, and we needed like fancy notation. It was something weird. But like, yeah, I would say that I've never had to do that, because like it's hard to imagine scenarios where you'd actually need to clarify that, where there isn't already a good way to notate it. Like something I can't get into because there's not enough time is a lot of specifics on each instrument, which gets into like learning how to orchestrate and write for them well, and it kind of veers into a different territory. But yeah, that would sort of answer a lot of that. It's just understanding the instruments more and what those players expect to see, or what they do when they just see a quarter note on the page or whatever.
Is it okay if I ask my second question?
Yeah, go ahead, and then.
I don't think it is. Assuming that people still use paper and don't just use iPads for everything, do you have opinions on like paper size?
Yeah, 8.5 by 11 if you're in the U.S. and A4 if you're anywhere else in the world. I mean, print your scores if you can. Usually, it really just depends on it. But they're standard paper sizes, so that's letter size, and then legal or tabloid for scores in the U.S., and then A3 for scores in Europe. Actually, I guess I can comment that some orchestras actually do print on a special paper size called concert, which is 10 by 13 inches. But I only do that if they ask me to format it that way. Anyway, go ahead.
I don't know how to form this into a question. Really dealing with like chromaticism, right? So if you have like some chromatic lines that are kind of going all over the place, how do you deal with sharps and flats and naturals and all of that? Because sometimes I feel like if I'm going to have to notice something like that, it's just a mess on the page.
Yeah. The truth is, not everything's going to have an easy look if it's super chromatic. I mean, and that's going to depend on the context. Like, first, make it as close to the key as you can in terms of that. Certain keys are going to favor sharps versus flats, of course, based on their harmonic minor and whatever. So I think find a way to reduce accidentals so you're not repeating stuff without having to use double accidentals, is as best you can kind of do in those cases. Sometimes not everything's going to come out perfectly clean, and that's the sad reality, is we have to make compromises. Any more questions? Yes.
When you, I was curious about the past 4 bars of the group symbol you were using for like the comping parts when you were talking about percussion. Do you ever like add text that's like use the same group, or do you think that's kind of implied?
That's definitely implied, yeah.
And also, I had never really seen the 4-bar ones like that, where there's like empty bars on either side. Is that common? I guess I've just never seen it, or like.
I'm forgetting to repeat the questions in the microphone like I'm supposed to. Sorry, MAGFest. The question is those 4 repeats common? And sure, if they work. I mean, there's not a lot of instances, I think, where you literally want someone to just repeat exactly the last 4 measures without change. So they're not going to get used a lot. But I don't think there's any rhythm section player that's going to not understand what that is, even if it's their first time seeing it. And all you have to do is tell them what it means, if that's the case. Right.
And just about one other question.
Go ahead.
How often do you take, when you're organizing the actual individual parts, do you take page turns into consideration?
Not as often as I should, but yes, you should think about the page turns a lot. Define multi-bar rests, multi-measure rests. Question is, do you think about page turns? And yes, you should. It's something I've not been always good at, but it's important to deal with. If the part is more than 2 pages, of course. So Yeah, find multi-bar rests and just think about how they're going to handle it and find the best solution from that. I mean, I think it's okay. I guess I should say, it's okay if the pages do not all look the same. Like if one page has 9 systems and the next has 7 because that's where the page turn is best, that's fine. I think a good page turn is better than complete uniformity if you're having to like make compromises and decisions. For sure. Okay, so one I gotta change some computer settings here, but one very nice person did turn in a score with the idea that we would go edit it and apply what we have learned today. So here we have, oh my God, here we have, what? I just changed the settings. Here we have nothing. Oh, I know why I didn't keep the changes. Okay. So, we have a score that was submitted by a arranger. We're going to keep names anonymous just in case anybody feels embarrassed or whatever. So, and we'll see this get edited in real time here. See if we can apply what we've learned in the next 13 minutes. So, right away, you look at this, we'll see some clutter. What this actually looks like to my eyes is that the piece was arranged in Logic or some other DAW, and then the MIDI was imported into Sibelius. And that's what this looks like right away to me, which is a very common workflow, so there's nothing wrong with that. Let's see what we can do. What's missing right now? What have we learned today that the score should have and look like?
Big time signatures.
I love that.
No rests.
Yeah, no bar rests.
Bar numbers.
Let's get all of that stuff. Bar numbers on every one bar. See how they show up. Oh, those bar numbers don't look right. Center in the bar, and we'll edit them. I'm gonna move through this kind of fast, so if you use Sibelius, hopefully you pick something up. There we go. Oh, it's not on bar 1. Show it to start sections. Some of these settings I've actually never had to change myself in like years, so I have to think about how to do it. There we go again. There we go. The default big time signatures, Sibelius has these, and I think Finale does too, but the default ones don't look good to me. There's some more editing I would want to do to that, by the way, but it's a personal preference thing. Someone said the tempo text should be bigger. You're correct. It should be way bigger. Let's see how big we can. This might be too big, but I don't know how the bar numbers ended up above the staff. Turn that off. Okay. Yeah, that's actually too big. We don't want it to look goofy. So we'll edit that a little more. Let's see something to think about. I would never use all caps. Let's not do that. Okay. Now, quick thing I would then want to do is, of course, reformat this to like not be super cluttered. Let's go down to a more typical staff size. Rest of that looks okay for now. There we go. If you're wondering what all these like tiny messages are, those are MIDI messages. That's why I think this was imported from a MIDI file. But I keep them actually, like when I'm orchestrating on a project, what I usually get is just a MIDI file that the composer made up, and so I kind of have to use those to figure out, oh, did they like actually change dynamics during something? Maybe they had a mock-up they gave me too. What else? What else could be improved here?
Double bar lines?
Just think of big picture, even not the details. double bar lines are great. This looks like a phrase start. I'd have to listen to the music to know for sure, which we're not going to do, but sure. Well, I'll try to. I know it's going to be hard to see resolution and all that, and when I'm working, there's going to be a lot of zooming in and out. But even looking at the big picture of the score, is there like anything that feels off? You're right, there is no composer information. This piece I know was composed by a man named McLean Dimer, arranged by, okay. That's very tiny though, isn't it? I don't have numbers memorized for this stuff, so I'm actually just like kind of guessing what might be right. Believe it or not, I don't have every detail memorized about how to make the score look good, because you learn the settings. So what you'll notice is what I'm actually doing here, if you use Sibelius, but this is similar paradigm in Finale and Dorico and all those, is I'm actually going into a setting to change the way this type of text shows up. Like I'm telling it, if I put a title in the score, I want it to always look like this. The not so good way is that I know people will do because it's fast and more obvious, is just going to the text and like manually making it bigger, and that like gets the job done. But there's also settings in all these software to just reset stuff, and if I ever did that, then it's going to go back to something I set before, or it's going to go back to the default setting because I didn't change the default setting in the first place. So that's why I keep going into these menus to change numbers rather than just doing it what in the short term might have been the faster solution. We'll make it a little bigger though. There's some margins that are funky, but I don't want to waste too much time on that yet. Okay, I'll try to zoom in and see if we can find anything else that looks odd. Actually, there's a couple other things I see that I didn't have time to bring up yet, like how this should all be connected by a staff. If I'm the conductor, I want to see groups of instruments nicely grouped. For some reason, there's no bracket here. Now all our woodwinds are together, like they should be. This actually is not in score order. Horn should be above trumpet. I don't know where baritone horn should be, probably in a different room. Sorry. Little details like having these instrument names marked, cymbals playing a flatted note for some reason. We can quickly get rid of that with a remove accidentals button. You have a question? I do not like to do that. I think there's two things. One is it's more work to do. But two, it is kind of just more annoying to read, in my opinion. In recording sessions, we actually never combine parts except for horn parts often get combined. Wait, no they don't. They often get combined on the score, but they don't, but each player actually gets their own part. So yeah, generally, unless you have like a 47 piece different parts and then like the score becomes unwieldy, then maybe start combining it. That would be the case, is when there's so many parts, and that might actually be relevant to some people here, because I have seen like community orchestra arrangements where you are trying to write for saxophones and stuff in the orchestra, and those can get really big. So yeah, combine it in that case maybe, but I find them a little hard to read. For the players, I would say it's almost always better not to keep them combined though, which is what gets me to like how it's a lot of extra work for the person editing the score. What else would we add? If I was editing this, I would want to be able to see the title on every page, which there's already text here, so we'll just use that. And it is, oops. And it is, of course, too small. Way too small.
Label as a conference score.
Yeah, that's good. Oh, Jesus. Putting in numbers, hoping for the best. Let's fix the title here. Heart of Thorns.
So you're saying you don't like key signatures?
I really didn't want to open that can of worms.
No, maybe you didn't say it. I just remembered.
Okay, so in recording sessions for films and games, we never use key signatures. Period. Even if it's like completely tonal the whole time, we just don't use them. I'm sure there's a historical reason for it. The modern reason is, I think on one hand, musicians are so used to not seeing them that it will mess them up if they suddenly do, the people playing the sessions. But also, I think just through practice, orchestrators and conductors have found that key signatures don't really help people play the music more accurately. What will happen is the musicians will still write in the accidentals anyway. And so why make them do what you can do yourself and just not use it? Yeah, if you use them in your music, whatever, it's fine. When I give people stuff to record, I also don't use them. I'm just used to not using them at all at this point. So yes, I didn't really want to get into that because it's one of like the most triggering. I don't want to misuse that word. The most like controversial thing that people seem to feel, especially if they just came from like a university or just a more traditional background. Like, I have to have key signatures. I won't know what key it is in. But my thought is, if you're a good enough musician to understand the benefit of a key signature, you don't actually need it anymore either. So there's a bit of that too. I'm just moving the title up higher. Oh, I said higher. Yeah, so and almost in no modern music do I think it's worth using key signatures. I would tell people not to, but I actually don't like getting into that debate too much. Though I do have a soapbox right here that I can use, so maybe it is the time. That'll be my panel next year, the key signatures and why you don't need them. I'll add in a nice subtitle that we'll fix later. I want to see if there's anything else here we can address. Besides the random little title details. If I was writing percussion parts, I wouldn't actually put a whole note here, though it's not super uncommon. If you want a cymbal player to hit something and just let it ring out, then we have a symbol for that. This isn't my main computer, so my hotkeys are not going to be the same, which is kind of annoying because I'm trying to set some. There we go. Nice little short, not an actual tie. Don't use an actual tie because it also just looks bad. It's one of those things that I see and I get sad. I don't know. Those should just be regular triplets. All of these standards, so again, I might say like, yes, you can write a whole note, you can do this. It's not like the end of the world, but it is just more standardization throughout it, more consistency and clarity throughout it. So if you do something different, you're doing that on purpose. And there's some frame of reference for the musician later. Yeah. So the question is, how do we make the percussion parts if we don't know how many players there are? So hopefully you do, because then you're not writing like 5 hits at once, right? That's a good question. Maybe I've been fortunate enough to not be in that situation. I think when I'm writing something, I still try to write it for a certain number of players. So. But order it in a way where, like, say it turns out your music needs 4 percussionists to play, but I would order it in a way where, like, percussion 4 is theoretically optional. What I've actually seen, some orchestras have request to actual percussion scores with all the percussion on one part, separate from the individual parts. So there's that too as an option. Then they can potentially figure things out themselves as well. But if you're really unsure, then you might just have that percussion score as the only option there. I mean, percussionists are probably more used than any other musician to reading bad notation. So at the very least, you're not putting someone out who's going to mess up. Yeah.
I had what I'm going to call an incident with a pianist who misread a score because she was reading it off of an iPad. Because I had a bunch about how the stat notation, and that she thought was, she didn't see the eights at all, and so was trying to do this. Are there any other like hazards of using an iPad for scores that like can also get you into trouble at some point?
I wonder.
Because the resolution was such that she literally could not see the rule.
If you know what their okay, so the only standard I can think of about like if you know your part's going to be read off of a tablet is that like your margins can be super narrow. You basically don't need margins at all, so you get a little more space, and so you could make use of that to make it a little larger. I'm trying to think of how reading off the tablet would have something different. The only other thing I can think of is page turns are actually more frequent, but potentially easier if you're using a foot pedal. So you kind of have to worry about every single page being a page turn instead of every 2 pages. I guess I've been fortunate enough where most of my stuff has been printed out first rather than read off of an iPad. And when the musician does, they chose to read it off of an iPad. So I'd have to also look at it to like give a better answer. Wish I had a better answer for you, but yeah, I don't know how it would change too much up to solve those problems. Okay, so I thought I'd get through more of the score, but I kind of dabbled around changing the title for a long time. But that's the time we got. So again, thank you for being here. I'm learning a little bit more about notation, so hopefully your gamer orchestras out there and your small acoustic ensembles are a little bit more happy with the sheet music they read. And if one day more sheet music gets published, it also looks just as nice as it deserves to be. And I'll be here all weekend.